Welcome to Catholic Comments. I am Wendy M. Wright.
And I'm John O'Keefe. Our guest today is Tom Kelly, who is professor of theology here at Creighton University. Tom is an expert on the Latin American Church and has recently published a book on Rutilio Grande. Welcome back to the program, Tom.
Thank you.
Well, our topic today, which is a very topical topic, is the change in the definition of martyrdom, or how one qualifies today to be a martyr. Here we are at the beginning of 2015, and this has been a brand new proclamation from Rome. This has implications in the early church, as we are aware. Somebody who died, for the faith, was simply acclaimed by the people, recognized by the people. But over the centuries, over the millennia, you've had different kinds of sifting and sorting of criteria for martyrdom. And up until very, very recently, one had to be martyred because of hatred of the faith, and not for any other reasons. Can you tell us something about the new criteria?
Sure. So the occasion for the new announcement was the declaration that Archbishop Oscar Romero is to be considered a martyr. Now, you may recall that in 1980, in March 24th, 1980, Romero was assassinated while offering Mass.
He's from El Salvador.
Yep, the Archbishop of San Salvador. And in a country where everyone is Catholic, it's difficult to argue that he died for hatred of the faith in the traditional sense of his beliefs. So a commission of theologians recommended, and Francis has accepted, the notion that hatred of the faith can now be interpreted as actions consistent with the gospel for which a person is persecuted. And this really opens up a whole different definition of martyrdom and a whole different group of people.
So in the past then, hatred of the faith would have been interpreted more as you're killed just because you're a Christian.
Or because you're defending a particular doctrine, yes.
Right. And this is, in kind of a difficult situation in El Salvador, in calling Romero a martyr was that the people killing him were, at least at some level, Christian, or he was part of a Christian society. So it was more of an attack on him as a person than on the attack of Christianity. So you're saying that this redefinition of martyrdom really opens the door for thinking about martyrdom in a whole new way.
Right, because what Romero was denouncing was the inequality, the suffering, the poverty, and the violence within El Salvador. He was motivated by the gospel to do that, and he did it very prophetically and bravely. He really walked with the poor, and so that's what he was killed for, were those actions.
So martyrdom on behalf of the gospel then, or the actions prompted by the gospel, is an exciting new thing. I know that often in the last several years, Oscar Romero, although he's very much admired in Latin America, across, in certain segments of America, in North America as well, there's been a caution about him. There was a fear that, well, these were really political ideas that were motivating him. It was a class struggle. It was something like that. And so you can't say that he really is technically a martyr. But now one can, and he has been proclaimed that.
Yeah, and partly it's interesting the way it was justified before. They said, the question was, did he die for his faith or did he die for his politics? But if you look at the role of the Church coming out of Vatican II, you cannot be a Christian without being involved in the world, and you cannot be involved in the world without being political. It's impossible. So this notion that you can make some kind of clean distinction between faith and politics is now gone. And so we look at people who, with their actions, are either furthering or defending the gospel. When they're persecuted, that is now grounds for martyrdom.
Now, so obviously there are people who have been close to this situation for a long time and have understood that if Romero was going to be canonized, that some changes in the way we think about martyrdom would have to happen, right?
Yeah. And part of the block of that, part of the resistance was that following Romero's death, the replacement that shortly after his replacement died, the next three archbishops of San Salvador were Opus Dei. And basically, they did not want the social role of the church to defend the poor and the marginalized. And so there's been a real resistance among the oligarchy throughout Latin America for hearing this message. And it's interesting because different articles have come out, and even his former enemies now are holding him up as the father of the country, an exemplar, an example. It's really interesting when people change the definition and Pope Francis holds him up, how much a lot of the resistance has melted away.
And this really goes along with a new favorable attitude toward liberation theology that's coming out of Rome under John Paul and under Pope Benedict as well. You had a much more cautious approach. John Paul himself obviously had lived in a country that was, very oppressed by a communist regime, and he was very afraid that possibly liberation theology might have some taint of origins, and yet that has really not been the case. But there's been a caution about that. Can you say more about that liberation theology today?
So yeah, there was a suspicion of certain methods, certain thought used within theology, especially how to analyze society, because some of them used Marxist analysis, even though they weren't Marxist. But the real person who changed it from within the Vatican was Benedict. He actually appointed a head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Mueller, who had co-written a book in 2005 with Gustavo Gutierrez, who was the father of modern liberation theology. So 2 summers ago, I remember I was teaching a course in Peru when I saw an article on the internet, and it said, "The war with liberation theology is over." Okay. And Francis basically said, not only is liberation theology a gift for Latin America, it's a gift for the world church as well. So people are sort of reappraising that whole thing.
And why would that be? Can you just, in a nutshell, why is liberation theology not simply appropriate for Latin America, but for the world?
Because the question at the basis of liberation...
Just pause for a second. I need you to get closer to that mic. Okay. Because your waveform's fallen off a little bit. Okay. So just start that question over after 3 seconds.
So the reason why it is so valuable for the rest of the world is that basically the question of liberation theology is, what does social, economic, and political development have to do with salvation? And because there's oppression everywhere, the way that people work that out will differ in every place, but the fact that the faith is involved in those discussions and pushing for answers to those problems is critical.
Do you think, you talked a little bit about the resistance to making this move that really has been ongoing for a long time, for decades, really. But I think we could also say that the desire to move the church in the direction that it seems to be moving right now has also been present for decades. Is it really Pope Francis who has unleashed this energy, do you think?
I think that he's unleashed a sort of confirmation of a particular approach that had been, considered a minority approach before. And now, it's difficult when you read his apostolic exhortation not to just see all of the themes of liberation.
The joy of the gospel.
Yes.
Right.
Running all the way through it. This is who he is. And we have to remember that, one of the largest blocks of Christians in the world, I think close to 40% of them are Latin American. So he really does reflect his roots in Latin America. And for me personally, I'm excited because, Rutilio Grande, who was a friend of Oscar Romero and actually predated him in his death, is also now on the path of beatification, and I hope he will be declared a martyr as well.
We probably should clarify for people who aren't too aware of the more contemporary processes that being declared a martyr exempts you from the criterion of having a miracle to be able to then advance to the stage of being beatified, and then eventually the stage of being canonized and put on the universal calendar.
In this sense, it's a lot like, if we think back to the early church, the martyrdom was in some ways a substitute for everything. If you got martyred, you could skip baptism, you could skip all initiation. It was like instant initiation into the kingdom of God.
Right.
And so to recover that is interesting, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're going to skip baptism these days, right. But we're certainly skipping the the affirmation of a miracle for the beatification. Although I believe that we still do have to have a miracle for the canonization process.
Yeah. But I love the fact that now there is an emphasis on service, that self-sacrificial service or self-sacrificial love that pays the ultimate cost is now rising in importance. And so he's already, for example, declared 3 other martyrs in Peru. An Italian and 2 Polish priests were killed by the Maoist insurgency Sendero Luminoso back in the 80s. They've been declared martyrs, and I think it's just going to start beginning because so many people in Latin America have lost their lives in the context of political violence. That
I was wondering about that. Does this really open the gates to having tons and tons of new saints?
It will, from the former colonial countries like in Africa, Latin America, and possibly Asia, where people in fighting for justice were killed. Now that is seen as possible criteria for martyrdom, whereas before it was not.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but in terms of you use the phrase "fighting for justice," I think there's probably the distinction would be made between armed resistance and advocacy, solidarity with, preaching for, working toward reform of systems so that people will not be oppressed would be probably part of the criteria there.
Right, and the language that came out of El Salvador was that they used to use the term the violence of love, and so the church can be a moral force that pushes back against these systems that are hurting and creating suffering. And oftentimes the pushback against the church is very, very powerful. And this is finally being recognized.
Well, we talked briefly just a second ago about the possibility of having a lot of new martyrs. But what do you think are the long-term implications for modern Catholicism to shift in this particular direction?
Well, it's really interesting. In one of the sections of his exhortation, Francis said that reality is more important than ideas, and he emphasized the role of action. So many times we think of people as faithful when they think the proper thing, and what Francis is doing is he's putting an equal emphasis on acting in a proper way, so that one's actions, if they emerge from the gospel and defend gospel values, are now seen as an act of faith that is just as valuable. And so we've needed that reset for a long time. It's not simply about what we believe intellectually. It's about what we do. And
I would also say, correct me if I'm wrong in this, but that there's a new emphasis on action that's not simply in terms of personal morality, but in terms of social change and social justice.
Yes, and that's absolutely correct. And that's one of the reasons why North Americans are having such a difficult time understanding Francis, because we tend to think in terms of the individual and what an individual can do. We don't usually think in terms of systems and social change because we think of the individual before the community.
And I think that's probably right, but how do you account for, say, European resistance? Because certainly part of this shift has happened because we have a pope from Latin America, from the global south. But you could say the resistance to moving this way was coming really from the established ancient churches of Europe. And what's going on there? I mean, they don't have the same kind of problem with individualism. Is it just a...
I'm not sure, because I think that Paul VI and John the 23rd were very much in favor of this. I think that the pushback came when we had a more conservative pope in John Paul II, and the hierarchy of the United States began to exercise a little bit more power. So I really do see a resetting with the common good that comes before the individual good that is already part of the culture in Latin America and Africa.
This is a fascinating discussion. Can you say more about how you think this might, filtered through perhaps the joy of the gospel, which seems to be getting a lot of attention and people are very excited about it. I'm not sure they're completely cognizant of how much of a shift it is, but it's not, as John said at the very beginning, it's not a suddenly a great break. It's just that the emphasis perhaps in what has been publicly proclaimed as, what is Catholic thinking these days, has been a little more in the vein of resisting or being cautious about this kind of radical social vision?
Well, let me get maybe an easy way to respond to that would be to give you an example. In our context, when we think of the Eucharist, we think of a religious ritual where we take something in that is for our personal holiness. I just finished translating a homily of Rutilio Grande where he argues that the Eucharist is a social symbol, and that just like the Eucharist, where everyone has a seat at the table and everyone is welcome and everyone has something to bring, that should be the model for how the goods and the world is shared out among people, so that you begin to structure reality through the way you understand Eucharist, and it's not just about one's personal individual quest for holiness.
What do we end with? What do you take away from this? I mean, personally, I mean, you've been working on these issues for a long time now, for 10 years or more, and so how do you receive this personally?
I mean, for me, as someone who's taught liberation theology and has taught about the Church of Latin America for 15 years, I always felt like I was sort of on the edge or the fringe, if you will, of Roman Catholicism, and now I feel like I'm right in the middle. And that's a strange feeling, to go from being someone who you thought was on the margins to someone who really is promoting what we feel is the core of the faith. It's a huge change. I don't even know if people realize it's happened yet, and it'll be interesting to see who actually gets on the train.
We've been talking to our colleague, Dr. Tom Kelly from the Theology Department here at Creighton University. He's a frequent guest on our program, and we've been talking about the change in the theology of martyrdom which has allowed really the fast-tracking, if you will, of the possible canonization of Oscar Romero and so many others who suffered in Latin America. Tom, thanks so much for coming down and being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
And this has been Catholic Comments from Creighton University.